The Invictus lay in silence on the barren planet, a relic of a time when it ruled the skies of countless systems, its once shining hull now worn and scarred from years of battle. The ship had been abandoned and left to rot by a galaxy that no longer remembered its power, yet something deep inside it still hummed with energy, a pulse barely detectable to those who dared approach it. But to Captain Aria Voss it felt like a heartbeat, like the ship was waiting for something or someone. Aria stood on the cracked surface of the planet, looking up at the imposing silhouette of the Invictus. She had heard the stories of its glory days back, when it was the flagship of an entire fleet. It had been a weapon like no other, a ship capable of turning the tide of war with a single strike. But that was long ago. Now the ship had been discarded like an old tool, too dangerous to be left in the wrong hands, and too broken to be of any use to anyone. She had heard the whispers from the higher-ups, the rumors that the Invictus had lost its edge, that it was nothing more than a glorified piece of scrap metal, and that the time had come to forget about it. But Aria was different. She knew the truth that the Invictus still had potential, more than anyone could ever imagine, and she intended to find it. Aria was a woman who never gave up, even in the face of impossible odds. She had spent her career searching for answers, digging into the past, finding clues that others had long since given up on. She knew that the ship was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of something greater, something that could change the fate of their entire civilization if they could just unlock its secrets. She had spent weeks studying the schematics and old records, trying to piece together what had happened to the ship, what had gone wrong, why it had been left to rust. But there was always something missing, a piece of the puzzle that was just out of reach. But today something was different. Today she felt a pull, a strange sensation that guided her toward the heart of the Invictus. The ship had always been massive, but now it seemed even more so, its presence overwhelming, as if it was calling to her, urging her to step inside. Her footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of the ship as she walked deeper into its dark interior. The walls were cold and damp, covered in dust and debris, but there was a sense of life here too, an energy that Aria couldn't explain. It was as if the ship itself was waiting for her to awaken it. At the center of the ship she found what she was looking for, a hidden chamber that no one had ever known about, not even the engineers who had worked on the Invictus years ago. The chamber was sealed with an ancient code that only someone with the right knowledge could break, and Aria had the key. With trembling hands she input the sequence and watched as the door slowly slid open, revealing a massive control center that had long been abandoned, but still held traces of its former glory. The console flickered to life, and for the first time in years, the ship seemed to stir. Aria stood there for a moment, staring at the blinking lights and the hum of machinery that filled the room, as if the Invictus had just woken from a long slumber. It was a moment of quiet before everything changed. The hum of the Invictus seemed to reverberate through the very air around Aria. As she stood in the heart of the ship, she had long believed in its power, and now it was showing signs of life again. The control center flickered to life with blinking lights and a soft hum of machinery in the background. Aria's breath caught in her throat as the ship's dormant systems began to stir. A low growl of power reverberated through the corridors, as if the ship was waking from an ancient slumber. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her as the crew gathered at the door to the chamber, their faces filled with awe and fear. They had never seen the ship like this, not since it was first abandoned and left to rot on this desolate planet. It had always been an object of legend, a story told in hushed tones, but now it was alive again, and they were witnessing something that no one had dared dream possible. Drelorian, the ship's chief engineer, approached Aria, his face a mixture of disbelief and wonder, his hands shaking slightly as he studied the console. This should not be possible, he muttered under his breath. The systems, they were all supposed to be dead. Aria didn't look away from the screen. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud still sent a chill down her spine. "But they're not dead, are they?" she said quietly, her voice filled with awe. The console blinked, and a holographic map of the ship's inner systems appeared before them, showing parts of the ship that had been completely unknown to them before. Massive chambers deep within the ship's hull, hidden compartments with advanced technology still intact. "What is all this?" Aria whispered as she moved closer to the hologram. The map showed weapons systems that hadn't been activated in centuries, ancient energy cores that pulsed with power and secret weaponry designed to tear apart fleets and alter the very fabric of space itself. It's not just a warship, DeLorean breathed. It's a living weapon, one that could reshape entire star systems. Aria's mind raced as she processed the implications of what they had found. She had always suspected that there was more to the Invictus than just its firepower, but seeing it laid out before her was another thing entirely. This wasn't just a ship, it was a tool of unimaginable destruction, and yet she couldn't help but feel the pull of it, as if the ship was calling to her, urging her to unlock its secrets, to use its power for something greater than anyone could imagine. "How much time do we have?" Aria asked sharply as the ship's systems continued to wake up around them. "Not long," DeLorean replied. "If we don't act quickly, the systems could destabilize again. We may never be able to access them once more." Aria's decision was made then. She couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The galaxy was facing threats that they couldn't ignore, and the Invictus could be the key to turning the tide of war, but only if they could control it. And that was the biggest question of all. Could they control something so powerful? She turned to her crew with determination. "We're unlocking everything. We don't leave anything behind." The ship rumbled as if in agreement, the sound of machinery whirring to life as hidden chambers slid open and weapon systems powered up. Aria felt the ship begin to respond to her command, to her presence, like it was alive and listening to her every word. "Let's see what you're really capable of," Aria muttered to the ship as she pressed a few buttons on the console and watched as the ship's power surged around them. Aria stood at the helm of the Invictus, her hands gripping the console as she felt the surge of power pulse through the ship. The systems were fully awake. Now every part of the ship seemed to hum with life. The engines thrummed softly beneath her feet, the air itself charged with a quiet energy that filled the ship's vast halls. "We've never seen anything like this before," DeLorean said, his voice filled with awe and uncertainty, his eyes scanning the data on the console. "The weapons systems are more advanced than anything we've ever encountered. It's like this ship was built to transcend everything we know." Aria's mind raced as she processed the information displayed before her. It wasn't just the ship's arsenal that was extraordinary. It was the ship itself. The Invictus was not merely a warship, it was a vessel for something much larger, something beyond what any civilization had ever dreamed possible. Hidden deep within its core was a power unlike any other, a force capable of bending space itself. "What are we dealing with here?" Aria whispered to herself as she navigated through the holographic display, showing the energy core at the heart of the ship. DeLorean's voice was shaking as he spoke. This is an ancient energy core, something far beyond anything we've seen before. It was designed to harness the energy of an entire star system. If we can get it fully operational, we can literally tear through fleets and destroy entire planets with a single command." "We can't," Aria said firmly, looking at him. "We won't use it like that." "Captain," DeLorean began, but stopped himself, his eyes flicking back to the glowing screens as if unsure of what to say. "We don't know what this ship is fully capable of," Aria continued, her voice low and serious. "But we can't use it to annihilate everything around us. It's too dangerous. We're here to protect the galaxy, not to conquer it." "But what if the galaxy doesn't leave us any choice?" DeLorean argued. "What if we don't have a chance to play by those rules? What if this power is the only thing that can stop the enemies coming for us?" Aria took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of his words settling over her like a storm brewing on the horizon. The galaxy was in turmoil. Old alliances were breaking down, and new threats were rising from the farthest corners of space. She had seen the warships of the enemy fleets firsthand, their terrifying technology and ruthless tactics. It was only a matter of time before they found them, and if they didn't act quickly, the Invictus could be their only hope for survival. She glanced at the display once more and then made her decision. "Prepare the crew. We're unlocking all the systems, but we do it carefully. We control the ship, not the other way around." "Are you sure?" DeLorean asked, his eyes full of concern. "We don't have a choice," Aria replied, her voice firm. As she turned to face him, "This ship can save us, or it can destroy us. We need to make sure it's the first." The ship seemed to acknowledge her words as the hum of its engines grew louder and the lights on the console flickered to life brighter than before the Invictus was ready. It was waiting for her command. With a steady hand, Aria pressed a series of keys, and the massive doors to the weapons bay slowly opened before her, revealing the ship's armory more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. She could feel the anticipation rising within her as the crew gathered around her, ready to unlock the full potential of the Invictus. "Let's see what you've got," Aria said under her breath as she stepped forward and activated the weapon systems one by one. Aria stood at the center of the Invictus's main bridge, the flickering glow of the control panels reflecting in her eyes. The hum of the ship's systems had become a constant presence, a reminder of the power it held, and the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. As she ran her fingers across the console, a sense of unease began to creep in, gnawing at her thoughts. The ship had awakened, its systems fully operational, but in the silence that followed, something felt off. Something deep within the ship whispered, but not in a way that felt comforting. DeLorean had warned her that reactivating the Invictus would come with consequences, but she hadn't expected this. The energy core hummed with an intensity she had never encountered before, sending strange vibrations through the ship's metal frame. It was as if the ship itself had a mind, a will, that it was now willing to share with her. But that knowledge felt more like a weight than a gift, and Aria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A sudden alert pulled her from her thoughts, and her eyes snapped to the main screen. A signal, faint and almost hidden in the noise of deep space, was coming from outside. It was a distress beacon, only it wasn't like any distress signal she had ever seen. This was something coded, something encrypted, and the pattern was eerily familiar. "Captain, you need to see this," Lieutenant Kale called out from his station, his voice tense. Aria walked over to the communications terminal, her eyes narrowing as she studied the signal. It was old, decades old, in fact, and it was coming from a derelict station on the edge of the galaxy, one that had been abandoned long ago. The station's name was etched into the back of her mind, but she hadn't thought about it in years. It was a former military outpost, the site of an incident that had been swept under the rug by the highest authorities. "This isn't just a distress signal," Aria said, her voice low and steady. "This is a message, a warning, and it's been waiting for us." Kale turned to her, his face filled with concern. "Do you think it's connected to the Invictus?" Aria's mind raced. It had to be. The Invictus had been built by an ancient empire, one that had vanished long before her time. A civilization that had mastered not only the art of war, but also the secrets of space itself. Everything about the ship, its power, its systems, seemed tied to that forgotten empire. The message could hold the key to understanding the full scope of what they had awoken. But the question remained, why had this warning been hidden so long? And why was it coming to them now? Before she could voice her thoughts, DeLorean appeared at her side. "Captain, we've analyzed the data coming from the signal. It's been intercepted. It's not a simple message. It's a direct plea for help. Someone out there knows about the Invictus, and they're scared." "Scared of what?" Aria asked, already dreading the answer. "Scared of what the Invictus could do if it's fully activated," DeLorean said grimly. "Scared of what the power inside it can unleash." Aria paused for a long moment, staring at the screen. The weight of what she had done, the decision to fully awaken the ship, was beginning to feel heavier. There were forces at work, forces that had known about the Invictus long before she had ever laid hands on its controls. The galaxy wasn't just unaware of the Invictus, it was terrified of it. "Prepare the crew," Aria said finally, her voice hardening. "We're going to that station. We need answers." The hum of the Invictus seemed to pulse with a life of its own as the crew sprang into action. But as Aria made her way to the command center, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she had just opened a door that shouldn't have been touched. And now, whatever lay beyond it was coming for them. The Invictus soared through space, its massive engines burning with power as it cut through the void toward the derelict station. The crew moved quickly, preparing for what lay ahead, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Everyone knew this mission could change everything. They were no longer simply exploring the mysteries of a forgotten warship. They were hunting down a potential enemy, one that had been watching them since the moment the Invictus had awoken. Aria stood at the command console, staring out at the stars ahead. The signal was getting stronger as they neared their destination, but it was still too faint to fully decode. The feeling of being watched had not left her, and now, more than ever, it seemed real. As if invisible eyes were focused on them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Captain," Lieutenant Kale said from his station, his voice tight with concern, "we're approaching the station now. We should be able to dock in a few minutes." "Understood," Aria replied, her voice sharp. She turned to DeLorean, who was monitoring the systems. "Any signs of movement out there?" "Negative," DeLorean said, eyes glued to the readings. "The station appears completely abandoned. There's no life signs, no active defenses, nothing." "But the signal's still active," Aria muttered under her breath. "Whoever left it is still out there, and they're trying to warn us." The Invictus closed in on the station, a looming shadow against the backdrop of distant stars. The station itself was a twisted mass of metal and shattered hulls, a remnant of a war long forgotten. Debris floated in a slow, silent orbit around the structure, the broken remains of something once important now reduced to nothing more than space junk. "Prepare for docking," Aria ordered. "Stay sharp. We don't know what we'll find in there." As the ship's docking clamps engaged with the derelict station, the crew gathered in the main bay, armed and ready. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, each member of the team aware that whatever lay inside could be the key to everything, or it could be their undoing. Aria led the way as they stepped into the dark, desolate corridors of the station. The air inside was cold, stale, and thick with the smell of decay. The walls were covered in old scorch marks, evidence of past battles that had taken place long before they arrived. The silence here was oppressive, as if the station itself was holding its breath. "Stay close," Aria murmured to her team. "We don't know what we're dealing with yet." They moved cautiously through the halls, every sound amplified in the dead silence of the station. Ahead, they saw a flicker of light coming from an open door. It was a faint glow, like a dying ember struggling to stay alive. "There," DeLorean whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's where the signal's coming from." Aria nodded, her hand resting on the weapon at her side as they approached the door. She pushed it open slowly, revealing a dark room filled with old terminals and shattered equipment. In the center of the room stood a single figure, a man, hunched over a console, his face obscured by the dim light. "Who are you?" Aria demanded, her voice firm as the team aimed their weapons. The figure slowly turned, his face a mixture of exhaustion and fear. You don't know what you've done," he said, his voice trembling. "You've awakened it. The ship. It's too powerful for you to control." "What do you mean?" Aria asked, stepping forward, her mind racing. "Who are you? What are you talking about?" The man's eyes widened in fear as he took a step back. "The Invictus. It's not just a weapon. It's a prison. A containment unit for something far worse than you can imagine. You've unleashed a force that was meant to stay locked away forever. And now, you'll all die for it." Aria's blood ran cold. The warning from the signal, the fear in the man's voice, it all made sense now. The Invictus was not just a ship of unimaginable power. It was something more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. And they had just set it loose. Aria's heart raced as she stared at the man in front of her. His words hung heavy in the air, each one sending ripples of dread through her. The Invictus was not just a warship, not just a tool of unimaginable power. It was something much darker, something she hadn't even begun to comprehend. "What do you mean, a prison?" Aria demanded, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Who are you, and why should we believe anything you say?" The man's eyes were wide with fear, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate, as though weighing his options. But then he slumped, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "My name is Captain Aldrich," he said finally, his voice strained. "I was once a commander of the fleet that built the Invictus, but we didn't know what we were creating. We thought we were building the ultimate weapon for the Empire's final stand. But we were wrong. The Invictus was never meant to fight a war. It was meant to contain something." "Contain something," Aria repeated, her mind racing. "Contain what?" "Something that should have never been released," Captain Aldrich whispered, his voice trembling. "The Invictus was designed to hold a being, an entity, far more powerful than anything you've ever seen. Something that can bend the laws of reality itself. And it's waking up. It's already starting." Aria felt a chill run down her spine. The Invictus had been built to contain an entity, something far worse than any weapon they had ever encountered. She glanced at her crew, who stood in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. "How is that possible?" Drelorian finally spoke, his voice shaky. "How could a ship be built to contain something like that?" "The Empire thought they could control it," Captain Aldrich said, shaking his head. "But they didn't understand. The entity within the Invictus was older than anything in this galaxy. It was beyond their comprehension, and when they tried to control it, they realized it couldn't be contained. They had to seal it away, deep within the ship's core, using the energy core as a lock. But now, the Invictus is awakening, and the entity is stirring. Soon, it will be free." Aria's mind was reeling. She had thought the Invictus was a weapon, something they could use to fight the enemies of the galaxy. But now she understood. They had woken up a sleeping giant, and the very thing they hoped to control could bring about their destruction. "How do we stop it?" Aria asked, her voice tight with fear. Captain Aldrich looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know if you can stop it, but you must, or the galaxy will burn. The entity is a force of pure destruction. It can reshape reality, warp space, and destroy entire systems in an instant, if it escapes." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Aria already understood. The stakes had just gone from unimaginable to catastrophic. They weren't dealing with an ordinary enemy anymore. They were facing something that could undo the very fabric of the universe. "We need to get back to the Invictus," Aria said, her voice hardening with resolve. "We need to lock it down again before it's too late." As she turned to leave, Captain Aldrich reached out, grabbing her arm. "Be careful, Captain," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entity won't go down without a fight, and it's already watching you." Aria's blood ran cold. They had awoken something far worse than they had ever imagined, and now the battle for their survival had truly begun. The air in the Invictus felt different now, charged with an eerie energy. As the crew hurried back to the ship, Aria's thoughts raced, each new revelation making her feel more and more like they were walking into a nightmare. They had awakened something ancient, something that had been locked away for a reason. And now, it was stirring. "Captain, the ship's systems are behaving erratically," Drelorian said, his voice tight with anxiety as he looked at the console. "It's almost like the ship is responding to something. Like it's alive." Aria's pulse quickened as she glanced at the screen. The Invictus had always felt like a living entity, its systems pulsing with power, but now it was different. The hum of the engines had grown louder, more insistent. There was something inside the ship, something deep in its core, that seemed to be calling out. "It's the entity," Aria said, her voice low with dread. "It's waking up. How much time do we have?" Lieutenant Kale asked, his face grim. "I don't know," Aria answered honestly, "but we need to move fast. We have to find a way to lock it down again before it's too late." The crew moved quickly through the corridors, heading toward the heart of the ship. Aria's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. The entity inside the Invictus wasn't just a weapon or a creature. It was something beyond comprehension. And now it was awake, its influence growing stronger by the minute. As they neared the core of the ship, the temperature seemed to rise, the air growing thick and heavy. The walls of the Invictus seemed to pulse, almost as if the ship itself was alive, reacting to the awakening entity within. A low, guttural rumble echoed through the halls, and Arya felt the vibrations deep in her bones. The ship was shifting, adapting, as though it was preparing for something. "We're almost there," Durlorian said, his voice tense. "If we can get to the core and trigger the containment protocol, we might be able to seal it again." "Might?" Arya asked, her voice sharp with frustration. "What do you mean, might?" "The core is unstable," Durlorian explained. "The entity's influence is already affecting the ship's systems. If we don't act quickly, the entire containment structure could collapse, and once it does, there's no turning back." Arya clenched her fists. They were running out of time. The entity's power was growing stronger with every passing second, and she could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her chest. They had to stop it now, or everything would be lost. As they reached the core, the temperature hit a sweltering high. The room before them was bathed in a strange, flickering light, the walls shimmering with an unnatural glow. The energy core, a massive sphere of radiant energy, floated at the center of the room, surrounded by a complex network of conduits and wires. The air around it buzzed with a strange, resonating hum, and the entire space felt alive, almost sentient. "There it is," Arya said, stepping forward cautiously. "How do we activate the containment protocol?" "The system should recognize the command automatically," Durlorian said, his fingers flying over the console. "But the ship's interference is making it harder to access the necessary controls. It's like something is blocking us." Suddenly, the hum of the ship's systems shifted. The walls trembled, and a deep, ominous voice echoed through the room. It was low, guttural, and filled with an otherworldly power. "You cannot stop me," the voice whispered. "I am beyond your reach." Arya froze, her blood running cold. The entity had already taken control of the ship. It was aware of them, aware of their every move. "It's speaking to us," Kale whispered, his voice shaking. "How is that possible?" "It's not just speaking," Arya said, her voice filled with realization. "It's inside the ship. It's inside the Invictus." The temperature soared even higher, and the room began to shift, the walls warping and bending. Reality itself seemed to bend under the entity's influence. The core of the ship was no longer just a power source. It was a gateway, a rift in the fabric of the universe itself. "We have to act now," Arya commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Lorian, can you bypass the system's defenses?" "I'll try," Durlorian said, his face grim. "But if the entity's influence is too strong, we might not make it out alive." The room was suffocating now, the air thick with heat and the oppressive hum of the entity's presence. The walls of the Invictus seemed to pulse, bending in and out of shape as if they were alive, responding to the force within the core. The ship itself had become a conduit for the entity's power, and every breath Arya took felt like an effort against the weight pressing down on her. "We don't have much time," Durlorian said, his voice strained as he worked furiously at the control panel. "The core is destabilizing. If we don't re-establish containment, the entity will break free, and nothing can stop it." Arya nodded, her grip tightening on the weapon at her side. She could feel the shift in the air, the unnatural crackle of energy that surrounded them. The entity was almost free, and the Invictus was no longer a ship. It was a ticking time bomb. "We need to disrupt its connection to the ship," Arya said, her mind racing as she tried to think through the chaos. "We need to sever the entity's hold on the core." Durlorian's fingers danced across the terminal, but the interface was glitching, corrupted by the entity's influence. "It's almost like it's fighting me," he muttered, sweat dripping down his forehead. I can't get through the encryption. It's like the ship's systems have merged with the entity itself. We're running out of time. Lieutenant Kale shouted, his voice tight with fear. It's too powerful. We won't survive this. Arya turned to face him, her expression hardening with resolve. We don't have a choice. If we don't stop it here, it will destroy everything. The rumbling grew louder, a low growl reverberating through the ship. The energy core flared with blinding light, and the temperature soared to unbearable heights. The very air seemed to crackle with the entity's growing power. Arya could feel it now, a presence in her mind, a voice whispering in the back of her thoughts, trying to break her will. You cannot stop me. I am eternal. You are nothing. The voice echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. But she fought against it, clenching her fists and focusing on the task at hand. She couldn't let fear take hold. Not now. I need more time, Drelorian said desperately, his hands flying over the console as the ship continued to tremble. Arya's eyes scanned the room, her mind working frantically. The containment system. There's a manual override in the secondary chamber. We can access it from here, but it's going to require a direct connection to the core. That's suicide. Kale protested. It's too dangerous. We won't survive getting that close. We don't have a choice, Arya said, her voice firm. We have to try. Now. With no time to argue, the crew moved quickly, heading toward the secondary chamber. As they entered the narrow passageway, the walls seemed to close in, the energy in the air thick with malevolent force. The ground beneath their feet quaked, and the low growl of the entity grew louder. Stay focused, Arya said, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. We're almost there. They reached the chamber, and the glowing sphere of the energy core filled the room with a blinding light. Drelorian approached the central control panel, his hands shaking as he began to override the security protocols. But the ship fought back, its systems glitching and warping under the entity's influence. It's no use, Drelorian shouted. It's resisting everything. I can't break through. Arya stepped forward, determination flashing in her eyes. Then we'll have to do it manually. She grabbed a nearby conduit and yanked it free, exposing the heart of the ship's energy matrix. As she connected the conduit to the override system, the entity's voice grew louder, its presence more intense. You cannot control me. You cannot defeat me. But Arya didn't back down. She felt the energy surge around her, the ship groaning under the strain, and with one final push, she activated the override. For a moment, everything went still. Then the core erupted with a deafening roar. The containment systems snapped into place, sealing the entity back within the core with an intensity that shook the very foundations of the ship. The walls stopped pulsing, the energy fluctuations died down, and the temperature returned to normal. Arya collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily, as the crew stood in stunned silence. The Invictus had been saved for now. The entity was locked away once more. It's over, Kale said, his voice hoarse. We did it. Arya looked around at her crew, each of them battered and shaken but alive. They had faced an unimaginable force and emerged victorious. But as she looked out into the stars beyond, a lingering thought gnawed at her. It's not over, Arya whispered to herself. It's never truly over. The Invictus had been silent, but she knew it would never be the same again. The entity, though contained, was still there, and in the vastness of space, there were always new dangers waiting. But for now, they had won, and that was enough.